So hello everyone. I don't usually talk about myself. I don't put the I in my stories because stories are usually about other people. But today I'm going to share some of my experiences as a foreign correspondent in Latin America that I hope will resonate beyond Latin America and with you guys over here. So just briefly introducing myself, I was born in Naples in southern Italy, but when I was 17, I moved abroad to study in the UK and in Germany, and then I randomly ended up in Chile after graduating because my brother was there. So I ended up living on his floor and doing an internship at an English language newspaper. And that's what kind of started my passion for journalism. I thought that to be a journalist, well, actually my first story was a scoop on the public toilets in downtown Santiago. Unfortunately, that vital piece of journalism is not online, so you can't see a slide today. I decided that journalism was what I wanted to do. So I went to study journalism. I ended up in London as a producer at the BBC World Service, but Latin America is where I wanted to be. So I decided to go back. And when I was about to leave London, some fellow journalists wished me luck for my new posting in Africa. And we'll go on to the first struggle. If the country is difficult to place, Ecuador is not Equatorial Guinea, it's in Latin America, South America, then you may have trouble actually selling stories from there, which is something I didn't immediately realize, but I realized quite quickly once, the editors would be like, oh, but we've already done a story out of Mexico this week, so we're not interested in your story from this country. I quickly realized that I was not going to make a living out of news, so I had to become creative. And I don't know if you guys remember this. In 2010, there was the big volcano in Iceland that erupted, a lot of disruption of flights around Europe. Well, that was somehow lucky for me because on a Saturday, this happened in Ecuador. There was a minor volcano erupting, and it was Saturday. It was a slow news day in Europe and in the States. So all of a sudden, everybody was interested in Ecuador. My phone was ringing. We wanted to hear all about how flights were being canceled. They weren't. But what I'm saying is that except for a few natural catastrophes, things happening on a Saturday when news are slow, it was actually a struggle to try and sell this country that editors were saying, well, this is geopolitically irrelevant. Why should we be talking about this? So what I came up with as something to do was to get into what I was into. Why was I in Ecuador? This is something that Anne-Marie was saying. Why am I here? And so I started thinking about the things I'm interested and I'm passionate about. So somehow I managed to get 4 stories out on Ecuadorian cinema that probably most of you have not heard anything about. But it's something that I'm really interested in. And those stories went out there, and I was very proud of being able to kind of look at different things in the country. And then I love hiking. So I managed to write a couple of stories about my mountain guru, Fabian Zurita, who was actually Ecuador's oldest mountaineer. And, I was constantly faced with the stereotypes and the cliches, So my editors had an idea of what an Andean country should look like. I mean, we often talk among foreign reporters of the cholita syndrome. So cholita is a term to refer to indigenous women in the Andean region. This is a cholita in Bolivia, and these pictures are from Bolivia. But we would say that any cholita story would sell because, cholitas are, colorful. They wear colorful petticoats. They have their bowler hats. But how do you go beyond the kind of interesting stories of cholitas wrestling or, cholitas on the catwalk? These are, of course, really actually great pictures and a great story. But how do you go beyond just the color and the stereotype of what your editors think that the story should be? And sometimes you can actually use it to your favor because you can ride the cholita wave, and I did this, and I went to interview Fabiola Quispe, who was a woman in like this tiny community in Ecuador, and she was remarkable because she had divorced her husband because he had abused her, and she set up this community of fellow women farmers in her community, and they would farm traditional, things like quinoa, but also she would talk to them about contraception, about how to deal with domestic violence, etc. And so, can you transform a stereotype maybe in a story that goes a little bit deeper? Sometimes. And then the challenges of being a woman reporter in certain communities. And so I'm going to show this video if I can. So there's no audio, but you can see this is a story I wanted to do. I wanted to interview this guy who was a shaman working at a public hospital in Ecuador. So he did this limpia, which is like cleansing of the aura, which was actually considered a proper treatment in a hospital in southern Ecuador, and I wanted to do a story on that. And it happened to me oftentimes that going by myself as a woman to rural communities, I would often be proposed to and find myself in like very stressful situations because I had to interview these guys, but I couldn't, do very much. This guy also actually proposed to me and told me I had like a healing spirit and that we would like rule the world together if we were together. I declined, but most importantly, that time I had thought about this, and I actually went to do this story with a cameraman, with a friend that I really trusted, and it was good to have a guy around that day. And one other thought is that sometimes it's very hard to be out there when you're inexperienced. So in Ecuador in 2008, I was reporting on a story on migrants, on Colombian migrants coming to Ecuador, and I was interviewing a junior minister, and at the end of the interview, I went to kiss him on the cheek, and he grabbed my head and kissed me on the lips, and I pushed him away and ran away. And I was like really young and inexperienced, and I had no idea what to do with that. I did not have an editor to write to. I thought that they were going to cut off my access if I like reported on this. So I wish, if you're out there and you're a woman working by yourself, there are so many networks, there's so much stuff to read and talk about, so don't be by yourself and do report harassment when it happens. And thank you. And timing. I was so scared that if I left Ecuador, something would happen. And we would always joke with friends that as soon as I left the country, there would be like a coup or something. Actually, I went on holiday after a year of being put, and then the 30th of September 2010, police revolt happened, which was, an attempted coup. I was in Naples, in my parents' place. The New York Times called to get me to write a story for them. I started crying. I told my parents that my career was over. I was never going to be able to be a journalist ever again. And then eventually I realized that it wasn't that important. I mean, yes, being somewhere, it's very important, but then you're always going to get a second chance. Like, I got my personal revenge by being in Ecuador, but not being too crazily put on a set date. Assange ended up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and we were hearing that the Ecuadorian government was already set on giving him asylum. And so I was talking about this with an editor at The Guardian, and the editor basically said do you think you can get one of these sources of yours to go on the record? And I was like, oh, I guess I can try. I didn't even think it was a story because we were all hearing this in Ecuador. So I pushed my sources. My sources had an agenda. They decided to go on the record. The Guardian had an agenda to like talk about Assange. And so I actually had a scoop almost by accident. And, you know, we were in the Guardian front page with, you know, this information. Correa, the president at the time, went on air to say that I was a liar, but 48 hours later, after a spat with the UK, they actually granted Assange asylum. So it was like my big revenge. So don't worry too much about timing. I mean, it's good, but it's, you know, you're always going to get another chance. You know, I also had another chance. I mean, you can see how worried I am there, because actually when breaking news happens, it's kind of terrifying sometimes. And this happened to me.
A las 4:25 de la tarde de hoy, 5 de marzo, ha fallecido el comandante presidente Hugo Chávez.
So this is Maduro saying that Chavez died.
On the 5th March, Hugo Chávez
and you can hear it. That's me. Anyway, the point of this,
next to the statue of Simón Bolívar,
maybe you can hear.
to mourn their president. Some have tears in their eyes. Others have been telling me that they feel like they've lost a father.
Now, most important question, have you noticed what I'm wearing? I'm wearing red. I don't know who said that, but that's so crazy. I'm like, red is my favorite color, but it's also like the color of the Chavez supporters. So this is what happened. Like, I was, you know, the biggest thing happened, and I grabbed the first thing and I put it on. There was no one around me to be like, hey, don't you think you should wear something maybe a little bit more neutral? I had been in the country for 2 weeks when Chavez died, and I was there as a stringer for the BBC. And this is how I worked. This was my bureau. This was my live position. It was a terrace on an 8th floor. You can't see the cables, but basically there were cables coming from the 3rd floor all the way to the terrace to hook up into that old camera. I would stand on 2 Pelican cases. The camera was like pointed towards infinity, and I was like all cabled up and talking. I'm showing you this because one afternoon, it was the 5th of March, at some point we knew that something was happening. It was like very big news. This is just a few hours before, you know, the announcement of Chavez's death. Basically, like, the sky opened, it became red, that's what the legend goes, and it started, you know, raining, and the wind started blowing, and that camera that you can see there went like that, and the lens broke. So when half an hour later I heard that Chavez had died, like the news found me at least like trying to like figure out what to do with technology. Like you can see I'm not like very technological. Like I did not know how to go on air, you know, like I was like, I couldn't even think about what was happening in the country. But, you know, so breaking news is a big challenge that you can kind of work around. But it's also a big challenge because it represents money, you know, like you want to be there doing those live hits. It's like quick money. It's like actually quite, like it creates a lot of adrenaline. It's like what people see you doing, etc. But I was on that terrace thinking about how to go live, like with the camera, etc. And people in London or wherever, they were asking me, so what are people feeling in the street? And I had no idea. Like, and I was trying to like get out there to like really, you know, go and news gather. It's a fine balance. Like, I think you can try and push. I managed to eventually like put on that red jacket and go out, but you know, it is a fine balance, and it's not always like easy to find it. And think still about the red jacket. Polarization is a big problem in Latin America, you know. I got into trouble with both sides in Venezuela. Like at one march, like at an anti-Chavez march, some women actually attacked me and hit me because they thought my short hair meant that I was a Chavez supporter. And at another pro-Chavez march, some students started chanting the BBC lies, and like people were starting to come around us. We had to calm them down. So polarization is a big issue, and you really want to strive to, you know, be perceived as kind of balanced as possible. Of course, there's no neutrality. I mean, I don't believe in neutrality, but you want to be balanced, and you want to kind of do a good job. And this is something I've always wondered about this story. So I think it was actually a mistake to put it out there because of the timing and because of how sensitive everything was. I was trying to really get into the head of a Chavez supporter after Chavez had died, and when Maduro was being, you know, there were loads of protests against Maduro, etc. And of course, you know, there was some context, like 2-3 paragraphs of context, but you should have seen my Twitter feed. It was quite brutal, and I still think that probably it was not the right thing to do. I should have had this just next to like an equal story of like someone who really like hated Chavez. Anyway, it's hard to get the balance. Next challenge, violence. So Latin America has 8% of the world population, but 33% of murders. I'm not talking about that kind of violence as a challenge. Of course, that's, you know, an everyday challenge for everyone, not only for journalists. Also, Latin America is a deadly region for local journalists. Like, as foreign reporters, we really have a much, much easier time. Again, I'm not even getting into that. What I'm trying to get into is like the challenge of reporting on violence, on like protests, on and finding the kind of right balance of what you want to report on. I became really uncomfortable during these protests in 2014 in Venezuela. This was happening outside my house every afternoon for 3 months. And these were the big, you know, these were the big pictures that were coming out all the time. And I felt that every time I went out, risking my life to do interviews, I was just feeding into the same stereotype and not breaking like any story. I was not comfortable with this kind of reporting. So, you know, see where you feel comfortable, learn how to become aware about, you know, being in violent contexts. There are hostile environment trainings available also for freelancers. You can approach me about it. I can give you more tips. But, you know, you don't have to do everything that editors ask, you know, because you're on the ground and you should know better, you know. And which also brings me to a similar challenge, which is working by yourself. This picture is from Ciudad Juarez on the Mexico-US border. That's a nice message for Trump and his F wall. And I have this picture up because it reminds me of the things, the silly things that I could have avoided. I was trying to get an interview with a people smuggler, with a young people smuggler, to talk about how Juarez youth have got very little chances to work. And I was there with a social worker, and we were going to explore the, you know, the border. And she was getting calls from, like, basically there were sentinels like all around, like checking what we were up to. And at some point they're like, you need to get out because we're coming for you. So we did get out. At that very time, I was not by myself, thankfully, but this is to say 2 brains usually work better than 1. 3 brains also better. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1 set of eyes. Other journalists may ask questions that you haven't even thought of. And this is something that Jakub was saying yesterday. Like, think about other journalists, other reporters as friends, not as like deadly competition, because it's actually really great to collaborate, and like, especially in like tricky situations, you know, what are you gonna, you know, what are they gonna get that you're not gonna get, you know? And also, I met my husband personally at a foreign correspondence course, and now we're expecting a baby, so collaborations can be very fruitful. And And then my kind of final thoughts are, so this picture is very blurry because it's in a club. It's at the Club Mexico, which is in Ciudad Juárez. I was in Juárez in 2011 when it was the world's murder capital and it was very dangerous. People were still going out dancing and they were having a great time. And it was very cool to actually, it was great to be able to be with Juarenses and to see what they were actually up to beyond the, beyond kind of the murders and all the stories that were getting out there. So really get to know a place, hang out with the people. I feel that that's one of the most important things, to just to know the language, to really get the lingo, etc. Really get to know something. I think it's one of the most important things. But then I think it's a fine line between that and getting into a comfort zone, because countries are changing constantly. Every country in each region is completely different. And if we get too stuck on the idea that we're experts and that we know it all, we may kind of start missing those things that are changing, and we may stop observing properly. So, I think it's very important to keep fresh and keep being surprised and to keep being inspired, because if you're not into what you're doing anymore, maybe you should be doing something else, which is partly why I'm in Italy right now, but that's another story for another time. So thank you very much, and you can reach me if you want.